What if a lonely 12-year-old boy, weeks away from the most dangerous exam of his life, stumbled onto a secret that Konoha had buried for over a decade? What if the son of the fourth Hokage learned to bend space itself, and see through it, before he ever set foot in the forest of death? Stick around, because this is the story of how Naruto Uzumaki became something the Leaf Village never saw coming. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this series is going to get wild fast, and you don't want to miss a single chapter. Alright, let's get into it. The sun was dipping low over the Hokage monument, painting the four stone faces in shades of orange and rust, when Naruto Uzumaki slammed face first into the dirt of Training Ground 7 for the 11th time that afternoon. Again, Sasuke said, not even bothering to look down at him. His voice carried that particular flavor of boredom that made Naruto's teeth grind, like losing to him wasn't even worth the effort of gloating. Shut up, Naruto groaned, spitting out a mouthful of grass. I wasn't even trying that time. You weren't trying any of the times. Sakura, sitting cross-legged on a tree stump a few yards away, didn't even look up from the scroll Kakashi had assigned them on chakra control theory. Honestly, Naruto, if you spent half as much energy focusing as you do talking, you'd probably land a hit. I don't need your help, Sakura-chan, Naruto muttered, hauling himself up with a groan. His orange jacket, the one thing in his closet that actually felt like his, was streaked with dirt and grass stains. He wiped his face with his sleeve and glared across the clearing at Sasuke, who stood there with his arms crossed, dark eyes unreadable, looking like he hadn't broken a sweat in his life. That was the thing about Sasuke Uchiha. He made everything look easy. The Sharingan hadn't even activated yet, not once, not in any spar Naruto had seen, and he still moved like a shinobi twice his rank. Every technique, every stance, every flicker of movement carried the weight of a bloodline that had been bred for centuries to produce exactly this kind of prodigy. And Naruto? Naruto had nothing but stubbornness, and a fox locked in his belly that nobody would explain to him. Alright, that's enough for today, came Kakashi's voice from somewhere above them. He dropped down from a tree branch with the kind of lazy grace that made it look like gravity was optional for him. An orange book. No, wait, let's not get into what he reads on missions, already tucked back into his vest pocket. Good work, all three of you. Sasuke, your footwork's improving. Sakura, that chakra scalpel theory paper was solid. Naruto, let me guess, Naruto cut in, arms folded. I need to work on my basics. Kakashi's visible eye curved into that unreadable crescent shape that could have meant anything from pity to genuine amusement. You need to work on everything, actually. But sure, basics is a start. Sasuke made a small sound that might have been a laugh if Sasuke Uchiha were capable of laughing at things that weren't tragic. Naruto felt his face heat up, but he swallowed the retort building in his throat. There wasn't any point. There never was, not with these two. He'd spent his whole life being told he was behind, being told he didn't measure up, being told, implicitly, in 100 small ways, in every sideways glance from the villagers who still remembered a night 12 years ago that nobody would talk about, that he wasn't enough. He was getting used to it. That didn't mean it didn't sting every single time. Now, if you've been watching my other What If series, you know I love giving Naruto the underdog treatment before the glow-up hits. But trust me, what's coming in the next few chapters is going to make this moment hit so much harder in retrospect. Because right now, Naruto has no idea what's sitting in a locked room 300 meters from where he's standing. No idea at all. The walk back into the village was quiet. Sakura peeled off toward her house with a quick see you tomorrow, and Sasuke vanished in that way he always did, 1 second present, the next just gone, like he couldn't stand to share the road with anyone longer than necessary. Naruto watched him go with a familiar knot tightening in his chest. Not quite jealousy. Not quite anger. Something in between that he didn't have a word for yet. He kicked a pebble down the empty street, hands shoved deep into his pockets, and found himself wandering, not toward his apartment, not toward Ichiraku's for a bowl of ramen to drown his sorrows in noodles and broth, but toward the base of the Hokage Tower, where the lights in the upper windows were just beginning to flicker on against the darkening sky. He didn't plan it. His feet just took him there, the way they sometimes did on the bad days. The guards at the base of the tower knew him, knew him well enough, at this point, that one of them simply nodded him through toward the private elevator that led to the Hokage's office. It wasn't unusual, exactly. Old man Hokage had a soft spot for him, always had, ever since Naruto was old enough to sneak into his office and doodle on important documents just to get a reaction out of him. He found Hiruzen Sarutobi exactly where he always was at this hour, seated behind that enormous desk buried under paperwork, a steaming cup of green tea at his elbow, his Hokage hat resting on a stand beside him like a second, silent occupant of the room. "Naruto," the old man said, glancing up with a faint, tired smile. "I wasn't expecting you this evening." "Yeah, well." Naruto flopped himself down into the chair across from the desk without waiting for an invitation, the way he always did. "Training was rough. Thought I'd come annoy you instead of eating alone." Hiruzen chuckled, setting down his brush. "You are welcome here any time, you know that." For a while, neither of them said much. The Hokage poured a second cup of tea and slid it across the desk. Naruto took it without complaint, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic, letting the steam curl up into his face. Down below, through the window, the village was beginning to light its lanterns one by one. Small points of gold scattered across the dusk like the whole village was holding its breath before the exams that everyone kept whispering about. "Old man," Naruto said finally, staring down into his tea, "do you think I'll ever be as strong as—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Never mind." "Stupid question." Hiruzen studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that made Naruto feel like the old man could see straight through his skull into whatever mess of insecurities lived there. "It's not a stupid question," he said at last. "Finish it." Naruto's grip on the cup tightened. "As strong as the fourth Hokage. Everyone talks about him like he was, I don't know. Like nobody's ever going to be that strong again. Like it's just this ceiling nobody can touch." He shook his head. "Sasuke's got the Uchiha name behind him. His whole clan was full of geniuses. Sakura's smarter than half the Jonin in this village already. And me? I've got nothing. No clan. No name. No parents." He forced a laugh that came out hollow. "Just some idiot with a fox stuck in his gut and a headband he barely earned." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Naruto glanced up, half expecting the old man to have drifted off. He did that sometimes, in the evenings, but Hiruzen's expression had gone unusually still. Unusually careful. "Naruto," he said slowly, "you earned that headband. Never let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." "Sure." Naruto shrugged, looking away. Hiruzen set down his own cup. There was something working behind his eyes, some old, complicated calculation that Naruto couldn't read, the kind adults did when they were deciding how much of the truth a person could handle. Finally, the old man rose from his chair with a small grunt of effort, crossed to a locked cabinet behind his desk, and retrieved a small, plain wooden box from the back of it. He set it down in front of Naruto without ceremony. "What's this?" Naruto asked, staring at it. It wasn't much to look at, dark wood, a little worn at the corners, no markings on the lid at all. "Something I've been holding on to," Hiruzen said, "for longer than you've been alive, in a manner of speaking. It belonged to someone who cared about you a great deal. More than you could possibly know." He paused. "I think it's time you had it." Naruto's throat went tight in a way he didn't fully understand. "Who did it belong to?" The old man's expression flickered, grief, maybe, or something adjacent to it, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Someone I was very proud to call a student," he said quietly. "That's all I can tell you right now, Naruto. I'm sorry. There are reasons, village reasons, dangerous reasons, that this has to stay quiet a little longer. But I couldn't keep this from you forever. It isn't right." Naruto stared down at the box like it might bite him. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded cloth, was a single brass key, old, tarnished at the edges, etched with a spiral design that looked almost like the symbol on the back of his own jacket. Beside it sat a small, folded photograph, edges soft with age, and a torn corner of paper with handwriting scrawled across it in fast, looping script, words Naruto couldn't quite make out in the dim lamplight. He picked up the photograph first, unfolding it with careful fingers. It showed a man, young, maybe in his mid-20s, with wild spiky blonde hair and a wide, easy grin, standing in front of the Hokage monument in a long white coat with flame patterns licking up from the hem. His arms were crossed, his headband gleaming, his whole posture radiating the kind of effortless confidence that made you want to trust him immediately. Something about the man's face made Naruto's chest ache in a way he couldn't explain. "Who is this?" he asked, voice quieter now. Hiruzen was silent for a long moment, gazing at the photograph over Naruto's shoulder with an expression that looked almost pained. "In time, Naruto. I promise you, in time, you'll know everything, but not tonight." He tapped the brass key gently. "That key belongs to a room in the archive beneath this tower. A sealed room. I want you to have it, but I need you to understand that whatever you find there, you cannot speak of it to anyone. Not your teammates. Not Kakashi. No one. Do you understand? There are people in this village who would use what's down there against you, against everything I've tried to protect you from." Naruto's fingers curled around the key, the metal cool and strange against his palm, humming faintly with something that felt less like temperature and more like memory, though that made no sense at all, and he pushed the thought away before it could take root. "Old man," he said slowly, "is this about my parents?" Hiruzen's eyes didn't waver, but something behind them did. "Go home and rest, Naruto. It's getting late." He reached out and closed the lid of the box gently. "Keep the key somewhere safe, and when you're ready, truly ready, you'll know it." It wasn't an answer. Naruto knew a dodge when he heard one. He'd been dodging questions about his own life his whole time in the academy, about the fox, about his parents, about the whispers that followed him down every street in the village. But there was something in the old man's face tonight that stopped him from pushing further. Something that looked almost like fear. He pocketed the key, tucked the photograph carefully into his jacket, and left the office without another word, the wooden box tucked under his arm. Now, here's where it gets good. Because Naruto Uzumaki has never in his life been able to leave a mystery alone. And this is a boy who once broke into the Forbidden Scroll vault on a dare from a con artist in disguise. You think he's going to sit on this for long? Not a chance. Stick with me, because the next scene is where this story really starts to move. And hey, if you're enjoying the ride so far, drop a comment telling me what you think Naruto's about to find. I read every single one. He didn't go home. He told himself he would, that he'd head back to his cramped little apartment, eat a cup of instant noodles standing over the sink, fall asleep staring at the ceiling like he did most nights. But his feet had other plans, and by the time the moon had climbed fully over the rooftops of Konoha, Naruto found himself crouched in the shadow of a drainage alley behind the Hokage Tower, staring up at the building's lower windows, key burning a hole in his pocket. A sealed room in the archive beneath this tower. He knew the tower's layout reasonably well, knew the public floors, the mission assignment desk, the Hokage's office, the labyrinth of hallways where Chūnin filed reports late into the night. But the archive, the real archive, the one below ground level where old mission records and classified files were supposedly kept, that was a different matter entirely. He'd heard whispers about it from older genin. Heard that it was guarded, that only jonin rank and above were even allowed near the entrance, that there were seals on the doors that could knock a person out cold if they tried to force their way through. He should have gone home. He climbed the drainage pipe instead, scaling the side of the building with the ease of a boy who'd spent half his childhood evading Chūnin patrols after pulling pranks across the village, and slipped through a maintenance window on the second floor that he was fairly sure nobody had checked the lock on in years. The tower at night was a different creature entirely from the tower by day, quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like hell breath, lit only by scattered lanterns along the walls, the corridors stretching out long and empty and full of shadows that seemed to shift a little too readily at the edge of his vision. He moved through them carefully, hugging the walls, ducking behind support beams whenever he heard footsteps. Twice he had to freeze completely, press flat against the stone, while a patrol of Chūnin passed by on their rounds, voices low and unbothered, having no idea a 12-year-old genin was holding his breath 10 feet away. Man, I really hope old man Hokage doesn't ground me for life if I get caught, he thought, easing forward once the footsteps had faded. The stairwell down to the lower levels was tucked behind an unmarked door near the back of the building, guarded by a simple lock that a boy who'd once picked his way into the village's confectionery storehouse dispatched in under a minute. The stairs spiraled down into darkness, the air growing cooler and staler with every step, the sound of his own footsteps swallowed almost entirely by the thick stone walls pressing in on either side. At the bottom, he found a corridor lined with doors, dozens of them, each marked with faded numbers and old, peeling paper labels he could barely read in the gloom. Mission Archives. Old Genin Records. A door marked simply Restricted, Chūnin Clearance, only that made his stomach twist with something between excitement and dread. He kept walking, following some instinct he couldn't quite name, until he reached the very end of the hallway. A heavier door than the others, set into an alcove, its surface marked not with a number but with a single symbol burned into the wood, a spiral, identical to the one etched onto his brass key. His breath caught. He pulled the key from his pocket with hands that weren't quite steady and pressed it into the lock. It turned with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silence of the empty corridor. The doors swung open on hinges that, strangely, didn't creak at all, as if someone had oiled them recently, as if this door had been opened more often than its dust-choked surroundings would suggest. Naruto slipped inside and pulled it shut gently behind him before allowing himself to breathe. The room beyond was small, barely larger than his own bedroom, and lined floor to ceiling with shelves. Scrolls stacked in neat rows. Sealed storage boxes with tags he couldn't read from the doorway. In the center of the room stood a single wooden desk, bare except for a framed photograph and, mounted on the wall directly above it, a large formal portrait that stopped Naruto dead in his tracks the moment his eyes found it. It was the same man from the photograph in his jacket pocket. Older here, more composed, painted in the formal robes and hat of a sitting Hokage, that same easy confidence radiating even through the stiff medium of oil paint. Beneath the portrait, engraved into a small brass plaque, were words that made Naruto's entire world tilt sideways. Minato Namikaze, 4th Hokage of the Hidden Leaf Village. Naruto stood frozen in the doorway, staring up at the painted face of the man everyone in the village spoke of like a legend, the man who had sacrificed his life to seal away the Nine Tails on the very night Naruto was born, the man whose name was etched into the mountain itself alongside 3 others. The man whose shadow he just spent an entire conversation with the Hokage comparing himself unfavorably to. Why, he thought, heart hammering against his ribs, is his picture in the same box the old man gave me? Why does this room have my key? He stepped further inside, drawn forward almost against his own will, and his eyes fell on the desk. Stacked there, alongside neatly organized folders and sealed scroll cases, was a small wooden chest, locked, this time with a proper mechanism rather than a simple key, engraved with the same spiral symbol, and beneath it, a single word burned into the wood. Namikaze. His hand hovered over it, fingers trembling slightly, the question building in his throat with nowhere to go. Could this actually be? And that was when he heard it. The faintest whisper of displaced air behind him. The kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all, but the specific, deliberate stillness of someone who had trained for years to move without making a single sound. Naruto spun around, kunai already halfway out of his pouch on pure reflex. The room was empty. But through the narrow gap beneath the door, in the dim lantern light of the corridor outside, he caught the unmistakable shift of a shadow, the shape of a figure standing motionless just beyond the threshold, watching, waiting. A pale, featureless mask glinting faintly in the low light, blank but for a single painted marking near where the left eye would be. Naruto's blood went cold. He'd heard stories, vague, half-whispered things older shinobi didn't like to talk about, of masked operatives who moved through Konoha like ghosts, who answered to no one the Hokage himself would name aloud. He'd never seen one. He'd never wanted to. The shadow beneath the door didn't move. Didn't speak. Just watched, patient as stone, as if it had all the time in the world and Naruto had none at all. His hand tightened around the kunai. It knows I'm in here, he thought, pulse roaring in his ears. It's been here the whole time. It probably followed me from the tower window. The chest on the desk sat forgotten. The portrait of his father. No, not his father, he told himself frantically. He didn't know that, he couldn't know that, not yet, stared down at him with painted eyes that seemed, in that frozen, terrified moment, to be silently urging him to run. The shadow beneath the door shifted at last, and the handle began, ever so slowly, to turn. The handle kept turning. Naruto's whole body had gone rigid, kunai raised, every instinct screaming at him to bolt for the far wall, to do something besides stand there frozen like a rabbit staring down a hawk. His mind raced through a dozen half-formed plans: throw the kunai and run, dive for the shelves, try to slam the door shut and bar it somehow, and settled on none of them, because in the next heartbeat the door swung open, and the figure standing in the frame simply stood there. Still. Silent. Making no move to attack at all. The mask tilted slightly, studying him. Up close, in the better light spilling from the archive room, Naruto could see it clearer now. Smooth white ceramic, a painted marking that wasn't a weasel or a cat or any of the animal designs he vaguely remembered hearing described, but something simpler. A single black line curving down from where the left eye would be, like a tear that had been carved and never allowed to fall. You should not be here, the figure said. The voice was low, flat, impossible to place as young or old, male by the timbre but stripped of anything else that might identify it. This chamber is under seal restricted access. Yeah, Naruto's voice cracked embarrassingly, and he cleared his throat, trying to sound braver than he felt while still holding the kunai like it might actually do him any good against whoever this was. I have a key. The old man gave it to me. Lord Third, I mean. He said it was okay. A pause. The masked figure's head tilted the other way now, and Naruto had the distinct, uncomfortable feeling of being read somehow. Chakra signature sent, the specific way he stood, cross-referenced against some mental file only this person had access to. Uzumaki Naruto, the figure said finally. It wasn't a question. Yeah. How do you lower your weapon? Something in the tone had shifted, fractionally, not warmer, exactly, but less coiled. I am not your enemy, boy. I have watched this room for 11 years. I know what is kept here, and I know what the Hokage intended when he entrusted you with that key. Naruto lowered the kunai slowly, though he didn't put it away. You're one of his ANBU. The old man's? I answered to Lord Third and to Lord Third alone, the figure said, and there was something almost pointed in the way he said it, like the distinction mattered, like there were other people in this village whose ANBU didn't answer only to the Hokage, and Naruto was too young and too new to all of this to understand yet why that would need saying out loud. This chamber has been under my protection since before you could walk. I was not informed you would be coming tonight. That is unusual. So the old man didn't send you? No. A beat. Which means either he trusts your discretion more than his own protocols, or he underestimated how quickly you would act. The mask tilted again, and Naruto could have sworn, though it made no sense, given there was no visible mouth, no visible anything beneath that smooth ceramic surface, that the figure was almost amused. Given what I know of you, Uzumaki Naruto, I suspect it is the latter. Hey! The ANBU ignored the protest entirely, stepping fully into the room now, the door easing shut behind him with barely a whisper of sound. His gaze, Naruto assumed there was a gaze somewhere behind that mask, swept across the shelves, the portrait, the locked chest still sitting untouched on the desk, and lingered there for a long moment. You have not opened it, he observed. I was about to when you scared the life out of me. Good. The ANBU's tone carried something that might have been approval. That chest is not meant to be opened by a 12-year-old alone, in the dark, without context for what he'll find inside. Some truths require preparation. This is one of them. He straightened, and Naruto had the sense the conversation was drawing to a close whether he liked it or not. Come, Lord Third will want to know you found your way here so quickly. It changes his timeline. Changes his... Wait, what timeline? What are you talking about? But the ANBU had already turned toward the door, and short of tackling a masked stranger who moved like smoke given rough humanoid shape, Naruto didn't have much choice but to follow. Okay, quick pause, because I know some of you in the comments last chapter were already speculating about who that masked figure was going to be, and I want to say, credit where it's due, a few of you were close. This isn't a root operative. This is somebody who's actually been quietly protecting Naruto's inheritance this entire time, and that's going to matter a lot more later in the series than you might think right now. Anyway, back to it. Hiruzen Sarutobi did not look surprised when the masked ANBU escorted a very sheepish-looking Naruto back into his office 20 minutes later. If anything, the old Hokage looked almost resigned, the expression of a man who had spent the last several hours half expecting exactly this outcome, and had simply been hoping, against experience, to be wrong. I had a feeling, he said, setting down his brush, that I underestimated how quickly curiosity would win out over patience. In my defense, Naruto said, you basically handed me a mystery box and told me not to open it. That's like telling Sakura not to hit me. It's not gonna happen. Despite himself, Hiruzen's mouth twitched toward a smile. He waved a hand toward the masked Anbu, who inclined his head fractionally and, in the space of a blink, was simply gone, vanished through the window without a sound, leaving no trace he'd ever been there at all except the faint unsettled feeling still crawling along the back of Naruto's neck. Sit, Hiruzen said. It seems I have less time to prepare you than I'd hoped. So let's dispense with some of the careful pacing I'd planned and speak plainly instead. Is that all right with you? Naruto dropped into the chair across the desk, heart still hammering faintly from the last half hour. Yeah, plainly's good. Plainly's great, actually. Hiruzen folded his hands atop the desk, and for a long moment simply looked at him. Really looked, the way adults sometimes did when they were trying to see past a face and into whatever lay underneath it. The man in that portrait, he said finally, was the finest student I ever trained. He came to this village as an orphan of the Third Great War, with nothing to his name, and by the time he was your age he had already shown more raw talent than shinobi 3 times his rank. I watched him grow from a reckless boy into the strongest Hokage this village has ever known. I watched him fall in love, marry, and become a father. He paused. And I watched him die, on the night you were born, protecting this village, and protecting you, from a threat that very few people alive today fully understand. Naruto's mouth had gone dry. You're saying, I am saying, Hiruzen said gently, that Minato Namikaze was your father, Naruto, and your mother, Kushina Uzumaki, was one of the finest kunoichi this village ever produced, fierce, brilliant, and every bit as stubborn as you are. They loved you more than either of them could put into words, in the short time they had with you. And they gave their lives so that you could have any life at all. The room seemed to tilt sideways, the way it had back in the archive when he'd first read the plaque beneath that painted portrait, except this time there was no shadow at the door to interrupt the moment, nothing to distract him from the sheer, overwhelming weight of it settling into his chest all at once. Why, Naruto managed, voice thin, why didn't anyone tell me? My whole life, they just let me think I had nobody. They let the whole village treat me like. He stopped himself, throat too tight to finish the sentence, though they both knew exactly what he'd been about to say. Like a burden. Like a mistake. Like the thing that had taken their precious fourth Hokage away from them. Hiruzen's expression flickered with old, familiar grief. Because your father made a great many enemies in his life, Naruto. Enemies who would use knowledge of his son against this village, and against you, in an instant if given the chance. Because there are still forces in the world, and forces within this very village, who would see a Namikaze heir as either a weapon to be claimed or a threat to be eliminated before he could grow strong enough to matter. I chose silence to keep you alive long enough to become strong enough to protect yourself. I understand now that it may have cost you something else in the process. For that I am sorry. Naruto didn't trust himself to speak for a moment. He stared down at his own hands, the calluses on his knuckles from 1,000 failed attempts at 1,000 techniques, and thought about every night he'd eaten alone, every birthday nobody had celebrated, every time he'd caught an adult's eyes narrow at him on the street for reasons he'd never fully understood until just now. Okay, he said finally, voice rough. Okay. So what now? Hiruzen studied him for a long moment before answering. Now, he said, we wait one more day. Because as it happens, someone else who loved your father very much is due to arrive back in the village tomorrow morning, and I think it's long past time the two of you properly met. And if you've watched any of my other Naruto content, you already know exactly who's about to walk through those village gates. Let's get into it. The next morning found Naruto pacing outside the main gate of Konoha a full hour before he needed to be there, which was, admittedly, not like him at all. He barely slept. His mind too full of blonde hair and a wide, easy grin frozen forever in an old photograph, of a mother's name he'd never once heard spoken aloud until last night. Of 100 questions with no one left to answer them except the giant of a man he'd only met a handful of times in his life. He heard him before he saw him, a booming laugh carrying down the road from a fair distance off, followed by the unmistakable, heavy footfalls of someone who walked like the whole world owed him a little extra room. "Well, if it isn't my favorite knucklehead!" Jiraiya's voice rang out across the gate, and a moment later the man himself came into view, tall, broad-shouldered, white hair pulled back in a long spiky tail, a massive scroll strapped across his back and that ever-present, slightly ridiculous confidence radiating off him like heat off summer pavement. "Heard a rumor you've been getting your butt kicked by an Uchiha brat. That true?" "That is not," Naruto started, then caught himself, because honestly it kind of was true, and there wasn't much point denying it to the man's face. "Okay, maybe a little, but that's not, Jiraiya, I need to talk to you. Right now. It's important." Something in his tone must have carried more weight than usual, because Jiraiya's grin faltered slightly, the theatrical bluster easing back just enough to let something more attentive show through underneath it. "Yeah? What's going on, kid?" "Not here." Naruto glanced around at the guards, the merchants setting up their morning stalls nearby, the general bustle of a village waking up to an ordinary day around them. "The old man's expecting us. He said you'd know why?" That got Jiraiya's full attention. His eyes narrowed, some calculation passing behind them, and for just a second Naruto caught a glimpse of the legendary shinobi underneath the goofy exterior, sharp, wary, the kind of man who'd survived 3 wars and a lifetime of espionage on instinct alone. "The old man told you to wait for me specifically," he said slowly. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." Jiraiya let out a long breath through his nose, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped, quiet and careful in a way Naruto had genuinely never heard from him before. "He finally told you, didn't he?" Naruto's throat tightened again. "You knew, kid," Jiraiya said, and for just a moment his usual bravado dropped away entirely, replaced with something aching and old. "I've known since the day you were born. Come on. Let's go see the old man. I think it's about time I told you a few things myself. Man, I love writing Jiraiya scenes, not gonna lie. There's something about a guy who's spent his whole life being loud and ridiculous suddenly going quiet that just hits different. Anyway, let's get to the good part." They reconvened not in the Hokage's office this time, but back down in the archive beneath the tower, the 3 of them crowded into that small, dusty room beneath the painted gaze of a man who, Naruto was still struggling to fully believe it, had been his father. Jiraiya stood in front of the portrait for a long moment without speaking, his expression unreadable in a way Naruto had never seen on him before. "Still can't believe they never let anyone put up a proper memorial for him beyond the mountain," he said eventually, voice rough. "Boy deserved better than a locked room nobody's allowed to visit." "There are reasons for the discretion, Jiraiya," Hiruzen said quietly from the doorway. "You know that as well as I do." Yeah, I know." Jiraiya turned, and when his eyes landed on Naruto again, something in them had softened considerably. "You look like him, you know. More than you probably realize. Same stubborn set to the jaw. Same way of walking into a room like you already own it, even when you've got no business being there." A faint, genuine smile ghosted across his face. "Your mother would have loved that about you. Drove her up the wall in your dad, but she loved it." "You knew both of them?" Naruto asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Knew them?" Jiraiya let out a short laugh. "Kid, I trained your father. Taught him everything I know, back when he was younger than you are now and twice as annoying about proving himself. Your mother, I knew through him. Fierce woman, Uzumaki through and through, could out-argue a war council and terrify grown jonin with a single look. The 2 of them together were..." He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. "They were something else. I'm not gonna lie to you and pretend I've got all the answers about what happened that night, or why things had to be the way they were after. But I can tell you this much, everything your father built, everything he worked toward, he built it hoping one day you'd be standing exactly where you're standing right now." Ready to know the truth, Naruto swallowed hard, blinking back something hot and stinging at the corners of his eyes that he absolutely was not going to let fall in front of these 2. "Old man said there's stuff of his in that chest." He gestured toward the desk, where the locked wooden box still sat exactly where he'd left it the night before. Said it wasn't something I should open alone. Jiraiya's gaze slid toward the chest, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or anticipation. That'd be his research, he said quietly. Sealed it myself, actually, the week after, the week after. Figured it was safer locked away than sitting around where the wrong hands might find it. He glanced at Hiruzen. You sure about this, old man? Once he sees what's in there, there's no putting that back in the box. Hiruzen's expression was solemn. He found his way here on his own, Jiraiya, faster than either of us anticipated. I think the decision has already been made for us. Jiraiya studied Naruto for a long moment, really studied him, the way Hiruzen had the night before, like he was trying to weigh something invisible balanced on the boy's shoulders. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate, and crossed to the desk. All right, he said. Let's see what your old man left behind. The lock gave way beneath a quick, practice seal release, a series of hand signs Jiraiya performed almost absently. Muscle memory from a technique he'd clearly used 100 times before, and the lid creaked open to reveal the contents within. Naruto leaned forward, breath caught somewhere in his chest. Inside, carefully arranged, lay a stack of notebooks filled with dense, hurried handwriting and complex sealed diagrams that meant absolutely nothing to Naruto's untrained eye. Beneath them, wrapped in a strip of protective cloth, sat a trio of three-pronged kunai, unlike any blade Naruto had ever seen. The handles etched with tight spirals of seal script that seemed to catch the lamplight strangely, almost like they were humming with something just beneath the threshold of sight. And tucked into the corner of the chest, folded with obvious care, was a single scrap of yellowed paper covered in a diagram Naruto vaguely recognized from stories he'd heard whispered in awe by older shinobi. His whole life, a technique that had, in a single war, turned one man into a legend an entire nation feared by name alone. That, Jiraiya said quietly, is the Flying Thunder Raijin technique. Or what's left of your father's notes on it, anyway. The seal formula, the marking theory, years of refinement he never got to finish. He picked up one of the three-pronged kunai with something close to reverence, turning it over in the lamplight. This technique is the reason the enemy called him the Yellow Flash. The reason entire battalions turned around and retreated the second word got out he'd been spotted on a battlefield. Space-time ninjutsu, Naruto. The ability to mark a location, anything, really, so long as his chakra touched it, and displace himself there in an instant. No hand signs to warn you. No wind-up. 1 second he's a mile away, and the next he's standing behind you with a blade at your throat. Naruto stared at the kunai like it might start glowing at any moment. That's insane. Can I? No, Jiraiya said, more sharply than Naruto expected, and set the kunai back down with obvious care. This isn't a technique you rush into, kid. Your father spent years, perfecting the seal work behind this, and even he built on techniques that came before him. Space-time ninjutsu isn't like throwing a fireball, or walking up a tree. Get the formula wrong, misjudge the chakra requirements, and you're not looking at a failed jutsu. You're looking at tearing yourself apart on a molecular level, or worse, getting stranded somewhere you were never meant to go with no way back. I've seen shinobi far more experienced than you kill themselves chasing shortcuts on techniques like this. The warning landed heavy in the small room, and for a moment nobody spoke. But Naruto said slowly, you're not saying no. You're saying, not yet. Not rushed. Jiraiya's mouth quirked, somewhere between exasperation and reluctant pride. Kid, has anyone ever told you that you hear exactly what you want to hear and nothing else? All the time, actually. That got a genuine laugh out of the older man, short, surprised, real. He glanced toward Hiruzen, some silent conversation passing between the two of them that Naruto couldn't quite follow, before letting out a long breath and turning back. All right, Jiraiya said. Here's the deal. The Chūnin exams are coming up fast. What, a few weeks out now? That's not enough time to build this technique from scratch, not safely, not even close. But your father's foundational seal theory is some of the best chakra control work ever put to paper, and frankly, kid, your control's been garbage your whole life because nobody's ever bothered to actually teach you the fundamentals properly. So here's what we're gonna do. I stick around the village for a while. We start with the basics. The marking seal, chakra precision, everything underneath the flashy teleportation stuff that actually makes it work. You put in the work, show me you're serious, and we go from there. Slow. Careful. My way. Understood? Naruto's chest felt like it might genuinely burst. Yeah, understood. I promise, I'll work harder than I've ever worked on anything, I swear. I know you will, Jiraiya said, and there was something warm underneath the gruffness now, something that sounded almost like the way a father might say it. You're your parents' kid. Doubt was never gonna be the problem. Hiruzen, watching quietly from the doorway, allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first easy one Naruto had seen on him in this entire strange, appended day. There is one more thing, he said, stepping further into the room, that I think bears mentioning before we close this chest again. He reached past Jiraiya, careful and deliberate, and lifted one of the notebooks from beneath the others, older than the rest, its pages worn soft at the edges from repeated handling, clearly one that had been opened and studied far more often than its companions. Your father was a brilliant man, Hiruzen said, but even brilliant men reach the edges of what a single mind can accomplish alone. In his final years of research, he corresponded closely with someone else, someone whose own bloodline offered a particular gift he believed could refine the flying thunder Raijin beyond anything achieved before. A way to track a target's movement, to predict trajectory and impact with a level of precision his seals alone couldn't provide. He opened the notebook to a page near the back, dense with notes in a second, distinctly different handwriting layered alongside Minato's own. He never finished the work. The war intervened, and then, other circumstances made further collaboration impossible. But I suspect, Naruto, that if you truly wish to understand the full scope of what your father was building toward, you may eventually need to understand this collaboration as well. Naruto leaned in, squinting at the second set of handwriting scrawled in the margins, tighter, more precise than Minato's looping scrawl, annotated with small diagrams that looked less like seals and more like eyes. Sketches of eyes layered with strange comma-shaped markings he'd seen only once before, in passing, on a face he knew all too well. His stomach did something complicated. That's, he started. A conversation for another day, Hiruzen said gently, closing the notebook before Naruto could get a clearer look. One thing at a time, Naruto. Tonight you've gained a father's legacy and a teacher willing to help you carry it. That is more than enough for now. The rest will come in time, sooner, I suspect, than any of us are quite ready for. Jiraiya's eyes had narrowed slightly at the notebook, some old memory clearly stirring behind them, though he said nothing more on the matter, just reached out and ruffled Naruto's hair with a rough, affectionate hand, the kind of gesture that felt so unexpectedly like family that Naruto had to blink hard again to keep his composure. Come on, kid, Jiraiya said. Let's go find someplace with actual sunlight, and start teaching you what chakra control's actually supposed to feel like. You've got a lot of catching up to do, and we're burning daylight. 3 weeks is a long time when you're being pushed to your absolute limit every single day, and a laughably short time when you're trying to master a technique that took a legendary shinobi years to perfect. Naruto was discovering both truths simultaneously, and neither of them felt particularly good. Again, Jiraiya said, arms crossed, watching from the shade of a tree at the edge of a private training ground tucked well outside the village's usual traffic, a clearing Jiraiya had specifically chosen for its isolation, ringed by dense forest on every side, the kind of place where a person could work on something dangerous without an audience. Naruto wiped sweat from his brow, chakra paper in hand, and glared at the small scorch marks smoking gently at the base of a wooden post 10 feet away. That's better than last time. That's marginally better than last time, Jiraiya corrected, which is still nowhere near good enough. Kid, the marking formula isn't about brute force. You keep trying to muscle your way through it like it's a Rasengan variant, and it's not. It's precision. It's patience. It's about laying down exactly the right amount of chakra in exactly the right pattern and not one drop more. I am being precise. You're being enthusiastic, which is not the same thing, and don't argue with me about this. Because I watched your father learn this exact same lesson the exact same way, and it took him the better part of a year before he stopped blowing craters into the practice posts. Jiraiya's mouth quirked, some old memory surfacing behind his eyes. Difference is, he actually listened when I told him to slow down. Naruto huffed, but he lowered the kunai anyway, closing his eyes and forcing his breathing to even out the way Jiraiya had drilled into him 100 times over the past 3 weeks. Slow. Controlled. Not a wave, not a flood, a thread. He pictured the chakra in his coils not as the roaring furnace he was used to calling on for a Raijin, but as something finer. A single strand, pulled taut, guided with deliberate care down through his arm and into the blade in his palm. The seal etched into the kunai's handle, a simplified version of the marking formula, one Jiraiya had recreated from Minato's notes, specifically for training purposes, began to glow faintly, a soft, steady blue light instead of the erratic, flickering Naruto had produced in his first dozen failed attempts. There, Jiraiya said quietly, and Naruto could hear the genuine note of approval in it even without opening his eyes to check. That's it. That's the feeling. Hold it. Don't rush past it, just sit in it a second. Get used to what correct actually feels like, so your body remembers it next time instead of defaulting back to overkill. Naruto held the thread of chakra as long as he could, arms trembling slightly with the effort of restraint being, as it turned out, considerably harder for him than raw output ever had been, until finally the seal dimmed and the sensation faded, leaving him faintly lightheaded and, for the first time in 3 weeks, actually proud of something he'd managed to do with his own 2 hands rather than sheer stubborn force of will. Was that good? He asked, opening his eyes. Jiraiya was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression Naruto hadn't seen from him before, something contemplative, almost wistful. Yeah, kid, he said finally. That was good. That was real good, actually. He pushed off from the tree and crossed the clearing, clapping a heavy hand on Naruto's shoulder. You've got a long way to go before you're anywhere near ready to attempt the full technique. I mean that, do not get cocky on me now. But the foundation's there. Same as it was for him. Naruto grinned, the exhaustion in his limbs suddenly feeling a lot more bearable. So when do I get to actually teleport somewhere? When I say so, and not a day before. Jiraiya ruffled his hair, ignoring the indignant protest that followed, and glanced up at the sky, where the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western tree line. That's enough for today. Go get some food and you look like you're about to keel over, and get some sleep. We're doing this again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until those exams, understood? Yeah, I got it. Naruto stretched his aching arms overhead, wincing slightly. Hey, Jiraiya? Those eye sketches. In my dad's notebook. The old man said that was a conversation for another day. Naruto hesitated, some old, familiar wariness creeping into his voice. The particular caution of a kid who'd learned the hard way that asking questions in this village often got him nothing but silence. Is today that day? Jiraiya's expression shifted, just slightly, not closing off exactly, but growing more careful, more measured, the way it had back in the archive when Hiruzen had first opened that second notebook. Not from me, he said finally. That's not my story to tell, kid. But I've got a feeling it's coming sooner than either of us expected. He glanced toward the village, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. The old man's been meeting with someone this past week. Someone who doesn't exactly officially exist, if you follow me. I think when he's ready, he'll bring you into it himself. Naruto frowned. That's not cryptic at all. I'm a Sannin kid. Cryptic's part of the job description. Jiraiya grinned, the moment of seriousness passing as quickly as it had come, and started off toward the village with his usual heavy, unhurried stride. Come on. I'll even buy you a bowl of ramen. Consider it hazard pay for putting up with my teaching methods. Now, some of you in the comments last chapter already guessed exactly where this was heading, and hey, credit to you, because you're about to be very right. But I promise, the way this actually plays out is going to hit different than you're expecting. Let's keep going. It was 2 nights later, well past the hour most of the village had settled in for sleep, when Naruto found Hiruzen waiting for him outside his apartment. An unusual enough sight on its own that Naruto very nearly tripped over his own doorstep in surprise. Old man? What are you doing here? Did something happen? Nothing is wrong, Hiruzen said, though there was a gravity in his tone that suggested otherwise, or at least suggested something significant enough to warrant a personal, late-night visit from the leader of the village. I need you to come with me, Naruto. Quietly, and without questions until we arrive. Can you do that? Naruto studied the old man's face for a long moment. There was something in his expression, a mixture of caution and something almost like hope, that made the usual flood of questions die in his throat before he could ask them. Yeah, he said instead. Yeah, okay. Let's go. They moved through the village's back streets in silence, avoiding the main roads entirely, Hiruzen setting a pace that was surprisingly brisk for a man his age. They passed beyond the residential districts, beyond even the training grounds Naruto knew well, until the buildings around them thinned out and gave way to older, quieter stretches of the village Naruto had rarely had reason to visit, a district, he realized slowly, with a very particular, very heavy silence hanging over it. Empty streets. Dark windows. The kind of stillness that wasn't just nighttime quiet, but the specific, permanent quiet of a place that had lost almost everyone who once lived there. His stomach twisted as understanding dawned. This is the Uchiha district, he said quietly. It is, Hiruzen confirmed, his own voice heavy. Most of it, at least. What remains of it? Naruto had never had reason to come here before. He knew the broad strokes of what had happened, the way most genin his age did. A tragedy, years ago, an entire clan wiped out in a single night, leaving only Sasuke behind. Nobody talked about the details. Sasuke certainly never had, not once, not in all the months they'd been on the same team, and Naruto had long since learned not to push at that particular silence. They wound deeper into the empty district, past rows of dark, undisturbed houses, until they reached a small, unassuming building tucked into a quiet corner, no different, on the outside, from any of the abandoned homes surrounding it, save for the faint, almost imperceptible hum of a chakra barrier woven into its walls, the kind of concealment technique that would keep the building entirely invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Hiruzen raised a hand and performed a quick series of seals, and the barrier shimmered briefly before allowing them through. Old man, Naruto said, voice low, who are we meeting? Someone, Hiruzen said carefully, whose existence is known to perhaps 3 people currently alive in this village. I need you to understand the weight of that before we go any further, Naruto. What you're about to learn, who you're about to meet, cannot leave this room. Not to Jiraiya. Not to your teammates. Not to anyone. Lives depend on that secrecy. Possibly including your own. Naruto swallowed hard, but nodded. Okay. I understand. Hiruzen studied him a moment longer, then knocked twice on the door, paused, and knocked once more. The door opened from within. The man who stood in the doorway was older, Naruto thought, than even Hiruzen, his frame thin and slightly stooped with age. A plain gray robe hanging loosely over shoulders that had clearly once carried far more weight and muscle than they did now. His hair, once black by the look of what remained, had gone almost entirely silver, pulled back in a simple knot. But it was his eyes that stopped Naruto cold in the doorway, dark, sharp, and unmistakably, achingly familiar. The same shape and depth Naruto had seen 100 times across the training ground from a boy who never talked about his family. Lord Third, the old man said, his voice a low rasp, and inclined his head in a small bow. His gaze shifted to Naruto, and something in his expression sharpened with interest, a careful, searching kind of attention that made Naruto feel, uncomfortably, like he was being evaluated against some private, exacting standard. And this, I take it, is the boy you've spoken of. This is Naruto Uzumaki, Hiruzen confirmed, stepping inside as the old man ushered them both into a small, sparsely furnished room lit by a handful of low lanterns. Naruto, this is a friend I've known for a very long time. I'll let him introduce himself as he sees fit. The old man settled slowly into a low chair, gesturing for the two of them to sit as well, and studied Naruto for a long, silent moment before speaking again. My name is Aizen, he said finally. Aizen Uchiha. And before you ask, yes, that clan? What remains of it, in any case, beyond the boy you already share a team with? His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. I imagine that answers a fair number of your questions and raises 100 more. Naruto's mind was already racing. You survived? The whole clan, everybody said. Everybody said the Uchiha clan was wiped out in a single night, save for one survivor. Aizen finished for him, quiet and even. That is, broadly speaking, true. I was not counted among the dead that night because I was not present. I had spent the better part of the preceding decade on long-term assignment far from the village, deep cover work, the kind that required a complete severance of contact, even with my own clan, for reasons of operational security. I returned to find my entire family gone, and a village unwilling, or perhaps unable, to fully explain why. His voice remained steady, but something old and unhealed flickered briefly behind those dark eyes. Lord Third made the decision, at that time, to keep my survival a closely guarded secret. There were complications surrounding the circumstances of the massacre that made my continued existence, quite frankly, dangerous to certain parties within this village. I have lived quietly, and largely unseen ever since. Naruto glanced toward Hiruzen, who nodded grimly in confirmation, offering no further elaboration. I'm sorry, Naruto said quietly, because it was the only thing that felt adequate to say, even knowing how small it was against a loss that size. About your family. I can't even imagine. Something in the old man's expression softened, just slightly, at that. You have more understanding of loss than most children your age, I suspect, he said. Lord Third has told me a great deal about you, Naruto Uzumaki. More, perhaps, than you might expect an old recluse hiding in an empty district to have any interest in learning. He shifted forward slightly in his seat. I have, in fact, been watching your progress for some time now. From a distance, admittedly, but watching nonetheless. Watching me? Why? Because your father asked me to, Aizen said simply. The room went very still. My dad knew you. Naruto's voice came out barely above a whisper. Knew me, and trusted me, in the final years before his death, which is a rarer thing than you might imagine, for an Uchiha to earn from an outsider to our clan, and rarer still in the opposite direction. Aizen's gaze drifted, briefly, towards some middle distance, some memory Naruto couldn't follow. Minato Namikaze possessed one of the finest analytical minds this village has ever produced. In his final years as Hokage, he approached me with a proposition, a collaborative effort to refine his signature technique using principles drawn from my clan's particular gifts. Predictive tracking, enhanced perception of movement and chakra flow. He believed, correctly, that a properly refined application of the Sharingan's abilities could elevate the Flying Thunder Raijin beyond anything achieved before it, closing the gap between marking a location and reacting to a target's movement in real time, rather than relying purely on pre-placed markers. Naruto's breath caught. The eye sketches? In his notebook, precisely. Aizen inclined his head. We made considerable progress together before circumstances. The Nine-Tails attack, his death, and shortly after, the massacre that claimed my entire family, brought that collaboration to an abrupt and permanent halt. I have spent the years since believing that work would simply die with the two of us, an unfinished theory, buried alongside two men who no longer had any need of it. He paused, something heavy and deliberate entering his voice, until Lord Third came to me several weeks ago, and told me his intention to finally reveal the truth of your heritage to you. And a rather different possibility occurred to me. Naruto's heart had begun to pound, some instinct telling him exactly where this conversation was headed even before the old man spoke the words aloud. You want to finish it, Naruto said slowly. The research. You want to actually combine them. The eye thing and the teleportation thing. I want, Aizen said, and for the first time his voice carried real weight, real urgency beneath its careful calm, to see your father's work completed by his own son, rather than left to rot in an archive no one is permitted to open. And I want to see the last true gift of my clan placed into hands I can trust to use it with honor, rather than see it fall, as I fear it eventually will, into hands that would use it for far darker purposes. What do you mean? Aizen exchanged a glance with Hiruzen, a long, weighted look that carried an entire unspoken conversation Naruto had no context for. There are those within this village, Aizen said carefully, who have made a great study, over many years, of the Sharingan's power, men who view a bloodline like mine not as a legacy to be honored, but as a resource to be harvested and controlled. I will not speak his name in this room tonight, but I promise you, Naruto, such a man exists, and has existed for a long time, watching and waiting for exactly the kind of opportunity my continued survival, and the survival of my abilities, might one day represent. His jaw tightened, old anger surfacing beneath the weathered calm. I am an old man. My eyes will not last forever, transplanted or otherwise, and I have no heir left to pass them to by right of blood. When I die, whatever remains of my Sharingan will either be buried with me, quietly and without purpose, or it will be taken, by someone I would trust with it even less than I trust fate itself. The weight of what the old man was actually saying began to land, slow and enormous, in the pit of Naruto's stomach. You want to give me your eye, he said quietly. You want me to have the Sharingan. I want to offer you a choice, Aizen corrected gently. Not command it, not pressure it, offer it, freely, and let you decide for yourself whether you wish to accept the burden that comes with it. Because make no mistake, Naruto Uzumaki, it is a burden as much as it is a gift. The Sharingan is no simple tool. It will not activate for you through desire alone, and even once awakened through the transplant, learning to master its full range of abilities will take years. Most shinobi never fully complete in a lifetime. It will strain your chakra reserves in ways your body is not naturally built to sustain. There will be pain, considerable pain, both in the transplantation itself and in the adjustment period that follows. And should certain individuals in this village ever learn what you carry behind that eye, you will become a target in ways you cannot currently imagine. He leaned forward slightly, dark eyes intent and unwavering on Naruto's face. I would not offer this to just anyone. I would not offer it, frankly, to Lord Third's own recommendation alone. Had I not spent these past weeks watching you myself and seen something in you I recognize, a refusal to accept the limits others tried to place on you. Your father had that same quality. It is, I believe, precisely what allowed him to accomplish what he did. Naruto sat frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him in a way nothing in his short, chaotic life had quite prepared him for. Somewhere at the back of his mind, a dozen half-formed thoughts collided at once, thoughts of Sasuke, who had lost everything this man had lost and worn it like an open wound his whole life. Thoughts of the eye sketches tucked into his father's notebook, unfinished, waiting. Thoughts of every time he'd stood on a training ground and watched people half his age surpass him through gifts he'd never been born with, and wondered, quietly, desperately, what it would take to finally close that gap. Why me? He asked finally, voice barely above a whisper. Sasuke's your actual clan. If it's about keeping the Sharingan safe, protecting your family's legacy, shouldn't it go to him? Something complicated passed across Aizen's weathered face, grief, and something that might have been guilt, tangled together in a way Naruto couldn't fully untangle. Sasuke Uchiha carries the last active bloodline of my clan already, within his own eyes, and will awaken his own Sharingan in time, through his own trials, as is his birthright, he said quietly. This is not about replacing that, nor undermining it. What I offer you is different. A second eye, drawn from a different branch of the clan entirely, offered not because you share our blood, but because your father's vision deserves to be finished, and because I believe, watching you, that you would carry it with the same integrity he did. Sasuke's path and yours need never intersect over this. What happens in this room tonight need never reach him at all, unless you yourself choose, one day, to tell him. He paused. But I will tell you honestly, Naruto. Even if by some chance I did believe this gift belonged with him rather than you, circumstances make that impossible regardless. Sasuke Uchiha is watched far too closely, by far too many interested parties, for a secret transplantation to remain hidden from those who would seize on it instantly. You, meanwhile, are underestimated by nearly everyone in this village. That underestimation, cruel as its origins may be, offers you a kind of protection he does not have. For now at least. Naruto turned the words over slowly, feeling the true shape of the decision settling onto his shoulders for the first time. This wasn't just about power. It wasn't just about closing some gap between himself and Sasuke, or proving himself to a village that had spent his whole life looking past him. It was about an old man's dying legacy, and a father he'd never gotten the chance to know, and a piece of unfinished work that had been waiting 12 years for someone brave, or foolish, enough to pick it back up. If I say yes, he said slowly, what happens? Aizen's expression, for the first time since Naruto had entered the room, allowed itself something close to genuine warmth. If you say yes, he said, then in a few days' time, once certain preparations are made and certain precautions put carefully into place, we proceed with the transplantation itself. under conditions of absolute secrecy, performed by hands skilled enough to keep it that way. It will hurt, Naruto. I will not lie to you about that. The recovery will be difficult, and you will need to hide both the procedure and its aftermath from everyone around you, including your own teammates, for as long as circumstances demand it. And once it is done, the true work will only just be beginning, the long, difficult process of learning to wield a bloodline your body was never born to carry. Naruto looked between the old man's steady, searching eyes and Hiruzen's quiet, watchful face, and felt something settle inside him. Not certainty, exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The shape of a decision he already knew, somewhere underneath the fear he was going to make. Give me a day, he said finally, to think about it properly. Is that okay? That, Aizen said, something like approval warming his weathered voice, is exactly the right answer. A choice made in a single rash moment is not a choice at all, merely a reaction. Take your day, Naruto Uzumaki. Think it through fully, the cost as much as the gift. Come back to me tomorrow night with your answer, whatever it may be, and I will honor it either way. Naruto didn't sleep that night. He barely tried. He lay on his back in his cramped apartment, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, replaying Aizen's words over and over until they'd worn smooth grooves into his thoughts. It will hurt. There will be pain. The true work will only just be beginning. He thought about Sasuke, the effortless way he moved through every spar, the quiet, simmering intensity that never seemed to leave his eyes even when he was doing something as mundane as eating lunch. He thought about the countless times he'd watched Sasuke's dark eyes track a thrown kunai with an ease that made Naruto's own attempts look like a toddler swatting at a fly. He thought about the massacre nobody talked about, and the boy who'd survived it, and the old man in the empty district who'd survived it too, in a different, quieter way, carrying grief like a second skin for over a decade. He thought about his father's handwriting in that notebook, hurried, hopeful, reaching towards something he never got to finish. By the time gray dawn light crept through his window, Naruto had made his decision 3 separate times and unmade it twice, and when he finally dragged himself out of bed to meet Jiraiya for training, he still wasn't entirely sure which version of himself had won. You look like death warmed over, Jiraiya observed, watching him stumble into the clearing with bloodshot eyes and none of his usual morning energy. Rough night? Something like that. Jiraiya studied him a beat longer, something knowing passing behind his eyes, though he didn't press. All right. Light day today, then. We'll work on chakra thread control, nothing that requires you to be sharp. He paused. You know you can talk to me, right? Whatever's rattling around in that head of yours. Naruto managed a tired smile. Yeah. I know. Just need to figure some stuff out on my own first. That okay? Kid, you're 12 going on 40 most days. You'll figure it out. Jiraiya clapped a hand on his shoulder, warm and steady. Come on. Let's get you moving. Might clear your head. Man, I love writing quiet Jiraiya moments like that. The guy's got this whole goofy exterior, but underneath it, he genuinely cares, you know? Anyway, let's fast forward to that night, because this is where things get real. Aizen was waiting for him when he arrived at the hidden house in the Uchiha district, seated in the same low chair as before, hands folded in his lap with a patience that suggested he'd have waited just as calmly whether Naruto showed up in an hour or a week. You've decided, the old man said. It wasn't a question. Naruto stood in the doorway a moment, feeling the full weight of the decision settle into his chest one final time before he spoke it aloud. Yeah, he said. I want to do it. I want your eye. Something shifted in Aizen's weathered face, not surprise, exactly, more like a held breath finally released. You understand fully what you're accepting? The pain, the secrecy, the danger that comes with it? I understand you keep telling me it's going to hurt, Naruto said, managing a shaky attempt at his usual grin. Pretty sure I've got that part memorized by now. A ghost of a smile touched the old man's mouth. Good. Fear is not the enemy here, Naruto. A shinobi who claims to feel none of it before a decision like this either lacks understanding of its weight, or is lying to himself. What matters is choosing to proceed regardless, with full awareness of the cost. He rose slowly from his chair. Lord Third has already made the necessary arrangements. We move forward tomorrow night. Tomorrow? That fast? The longer this waits, the greater the risk of discovery, Aizen said simply. And frankly, Naruto, the longer you sit with a decision like this, the more room doubt has to creep in and undo what courage has already decided. Better, I think, to act while your resolve is fresh. He studied Naruto's face a moment longer, something almost gentle in his ancient eyes. Go home. Rest as much as you're able. Eat something substantial, your body will need the reserves. And Naruto. He paused until Naruto met his gaze fully. Thank you? For trusting an old stranger with something this precious. I do not take that trust lightly. The following evening, Naruto found himself back in the hidden house, this time in a small back room he hadn't seen on his first visit. Sparse, clean, lit by careful lantern light. A simple medical cot set up in the center with an array of surgical tools laid out with obvious precision on a cloth-covered table beside it. Hiruzen was already there, standing quietly near the wall, and beside him stood someone Naruto hadn't expected to see at all, a woman with pale, careful hands and sharp, focused eyes, wrapped in a long medical coat that covered her from wrist to ankle, her hair pulled back tightly beneath a simple cloth wrap. This is Hana, Hiruzen said, gesturing toward her. One of the finest medical nin this village has ever trained, and someone whose discretion I trust completely. She'll be performing the procedure tonight. Hana inclined her head toward Naruto, her expression calm and professional, though something kind flickered briefly beneath the surface. I've handled delicate transplant work before, Naruto. You're in capable hands. I won't pretend this will be comfortable, but I promise you, every precaution has been taken to keep you safe throughout. Naruto swallowed hard, glancing toward the cot, toward the neat rows of surgical instruments, toward Aizen standing quietly near the window with an expression of solemn readiness on his weathered face. The reality of what was about to happen, what he'd agreed to, what he was choosing, right now, tonight, with no way to undo it afterward, crashed over him all at once, heavier than it had felt in any conversation leading up to this moment. Having second thoughts? Aizen asked quietly. Not unkindly. No, Naruto said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was true. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice held steady. Just realizing this is actually happening. That's all. That is a very natural thing to realize, Aizen said. Sit. Let us begin, before your nerves have more time to argue with your courage. All right, I want to be upfront here. This next part gets pretty intense, and I'm going to handle it with the weight it deserves rather than dwelling on gory detail for shock value. If medical stuff isn't your thing, that's completely fair, but I think it's important to show that a power like this doesn't come free. Let's continue. The procedure itself was, mercifully, a blur. Hana worked with quiet, practiced efficiency, her chakra-laced hands moving with a precision that made even Naruto's exhausted, terrified mind register a distant sense of awe. She numbed the area as thoroughly as medical ninjutsu allowed, murmuring low, steady instructions the entire time. Breathe, hold still, almost there. You're doing well. Her voice a quiet anchor against the disorientation building behind Naruto's skull. He remembered flashes. The sting of the initial incision, distant and strange beneath the numbing chakra. Aizen's hand, unexpectedly, closing around his own. A silent gesture of solidarity from someone who had once endured the same operation in reverse, decades ago, before the world had taken everything else from him. Hiruzen's low, steady voice somewhere at the edge of his awareness, murmuring words of encouragement Naruto couldn't quite piece into full sentences through the haze. And then, gradually, mercifully, the procedure was over, and Naruto was left staring up at a ceiling that seemed to swim and tilt every time he tried to focus on it. His head wrapped tightly in clean bandages. A dull, distant throb radiating from behind his left eye that promised, quite clearly, to become considerably less distant once the numbing chakra fully wore off. It's done, Hana said softly, her voice carrying the particular gentleness of someone speaking to a patient just surfacing from something difficult. The transplant took cleanly, no complications during the procedure itself. The real work now is recovery, and that part, I'm afraid, is largely up to your body's own healing. How long? Naruto managed, voice thick and slow, until I can actually see out of it. Days, at minimum, before the swelling recedes enough to open the eye safely, Hana said. Weeks, more realistically, before your chakra system fully adapts to hosting a foreign bloodline, you will experience fever, disorientation, chakra fluctuations that may feel entirely unlike anything you've dealt with before. This is normal, difficult as it will be, and I want you to understand that going in, so it doesn't frighten you more than it needs to. Naruto nodded weakly, the motion sending a fresh wave of dull pain radiating through his skull, and let his eyes, he corrected himself distantly, one eye now, at least for the foreseeable future, slip closed. Somewhere near the doorway, he heard Aizen's low voice, quiet and rough with an emotion Naruto was too exhausted to fully parse. Thank you, Hana, for your skill, and your discretion both. He's a brave kid, Hana said simply. I'm glad to have helped him. The last thing Naruto registered, before exhaustion finally dragged him under entirely, was Hiruzen's weathered hand resting gently against his shoulder, and the old man's quiet voice murmuring something that sounded, through the fog of pain and fatigue, almost like a prayer. And that's the hardest part behind us, at least physically, though trust me, the recovery arc is going to bring its own challenges. Let's jump forward a few days and see how Naruto's holding up. Spoiler, not great. The next several days passed in a haze that Naruto would later struggle to piece together with any real clarity. He remembered fever, a deep, bone-aching heat that left him drenched in sweat and shivering by turns, his whole body seemingly at war with the foreign chakra now threaded through his coils. He remembered flashes of half-lucid dreams, strange and vivid in ways his dreams had never quite been before, full of red and black shapes swirling at the edges of his vision even with his eyes closed. He remembered, dimly, Aizen's presence at his bedside more than once, the old man's low voice murmuring low, steady instructions on breathing technique, on chakra regulation, on how to ride out the worst of the disorientation without panicking his already overtaxed system into a dangerous spiral. He told his teammates he was sick, a stomach bug, he'd claimed through a hastily scrawled note left with the mission desk, bad enough to warrant a few days off training. It wasn't entirely a lie, not really, given how genuinely awful he felt most of those days, curled up in his apartment with the blinds drawn and a damp cloth pressed against his bandage eye whenever the fever spiked particularly high. Sakura had stopped by twice with soup she'd made herself, plain vegetable broth, careful and thoughtful in exactly the way Sakura always was when she let her guard down enough to show she cared, and Naruto had accepted it gratefully through the door, careful to keep the bandages hidden beneath a low hood, mumbling something about not wanting to pass along whatever bug he'd caught. You really do look terrible, Sakura had said, squinting at him with obvious concern even from the narrow gap of the doorway. Are you sure you don't need to see a medic? You've been out for days now. I'm fine, Sakura-chan, promise, Naruto had managed, forcing as much of his usual energy into his voice as he could muster. Just a nasty bug. I'll be back to normal in no time. She hadn't looked entirely convinced, but she'd let it go, leaving with a final, worried glance over her shoulder that had made Naruto's stomach twist with guilt at the lie. It was Kakashi on the 5th day, who proved considerably harder to deflect. Naruto had finally worked up the strength to venture out of his apartment for the first time in almost a week, bandages down to a simple, discreet wrap that could pass for an old training injury if anyone asked, the worst of the fever finally broken, though a persistent low throb still pulsed behind his newly transplanted eye whenever he pushed his chakra too hard. He made it as far as the market street, intent on finally getting something more substantial than broth into his system, when a familiar lazy voice called out from a nearby rooftop. Well, look who's finally resurfaced. Naruto glanced up to find Kakashi crouched on the edge of a low roof, that ever-present orange book tucked under one arm, his single visible eye studying Naruto with an attention that felt, uncomfortably, a great deal sharper than his usual bored demeanor let on. Hey, Kakashi-sensei. Naruto forced a grin, tugging his hood a fraction lower out of pure reflex. Yeah, finally kicked whatever bug I had. Feeling loads better. Kakashi dropped down from the roof with his usual unhurried grace, landing lightly in front of him, and studied Naruto for a long, quiet moment that stretched just a beat too long to be entirely comfortable. You've been gone almost a week, Kakashi said eventually. Sakura mentioned you looked pretty rough the couple times she checked on you. Yeah, well, it hit me hard. But I'm good now, really. Kakashi's visible eye narrowed fractionally, that particular expression he wore when he was assessing something far more carefully than his casual tone suggested. You know, it's strange. I stopped by the hospital earlier this week, thought I'd check if you'd been admitted, given how bad Sakura made it sound. A small pause, deliberate and pointed. No record of a Naruto Uzumaki checking in anywhere in the village this past week. Curious, for someone claiming to be sick enough to miss 5 straight days of training. Naruto's stomach dropped, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. Years of dealing with suspicious adults, finally paying off in the way he managed to keep his voice light and easy. Didn't need the hospital. Just held up at home, slept it off. Didn't want to risk spreading whatever it was around, you know? Kakashi said again, non-committal, though his gaze had drifted, almost idly, toward the edge of Naruto's hood, toward the faint, barely visible edge of bandage wrap peeking out beneath it. Naruto forced himself not to react, not to reach up and adjust the hood in a way that would draw even more attention to exactly the thing he was trying to hide. That a training injury? Kakashi asked, gesturing vaguely toward the bandage. Yeah. Banged my head pretty good on a tree stump before I got sick. Nothing serious. Kakashi's expression didn't shift, exactly, but something in the quality of his silence afterward felt heavier, more deliberate, than the conversation strictly warranted. Naruto had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being carefully filed away, not accused of anything outright, not yet, but noted, catalogued, a loose thread Kakashi fully intended to keep an eye on going forward. Well, Kakashi said finally, tucking his book back into his vest pocket, glad you're feeling better. The exams are coming up fast, and I'd hate for you to fall behind on training this close to the deadline. He paused, and something in his tone shifted, just slightly, into something almost gentler beneath the usual lazy drawl. You know you can talk to me, right, Naruto? Whatever's going on. I might surprise you with how much I actually understand. Something in the offer landed with more weight than Naruto expected, a flicker of genuine warmth cutting through his anxiety for just a moment. But the secrecy Aizen and Hiruzen had impressed upon him held firm, and he shook his head, forcing his grin back into place. Nothing going on, sensei, promise. Just a rough week. I'll see you at training tomorrow, yeah? Kakashi studied him a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind that single visible eye, before finally offering a small, easy shrug. Sure. Tomorrow, then. Try not to overdo it. Whatever this bug was, it clearly hit you harder than you're letting on. He vanished in a small burst of displaced leaves, leaving Naruto standing alone in the market street with his heart hammering considerably harder than it had any right to after such an innocuous conversation. He knows something's off, Naruto thought grimly, tugging his hood back into a more careful position. I need to be way more careful. Yeah, Kakashi's sharper than people give him credit for. Dude's a former ANBU captain. He's not just going to let a 5-day disappearance and a suspicious bandage slide without at least a little suspicion. This is going to matter later, trust me. For now, though, let's check in on how the actual recovery's going, because there's more to this than just physical healing. That night, Naruto made his way back to the hidden house in the Uchiha district for the first time since the procedure, moving carefully through the shadows, more paranoid than usual after his encounter with Kakashi earlier that day. Aizen opened the door before Naruto had even finished knocking, his weathered face creasing with quiet relief at the sight of him upright and moving under his own power. You look considerably better than the last time I saw you, the old man observed, ushering him inside. How is the pain? Manageable, mostly, Naruto admitted, settling into the same low chair he'd sat in during their first conversation weeks ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. It still throbs pretty bad if I push my chakra too hard. And I he hesitated. Keep what? Seeing stuff. When I close my eyes. Like shapes, almost, red and black, moving around at the edges. Is that normal? Something flickered across Aizen's face, recognition, tinged with old, complicated memory. That is the beginning of your chakra network adjusting to the bloodline now threaded through it, he said carefully. The Sharingan does not activate through simple desire, as I mentioned before, but the potential for activation begins asserting itself almost immediately after transplantation, particularly under conditions of stress, fear, or heightened emotion. What you're describing is likely your body's early, unconscious attempts to process visual information in a manner it was never originally built for. It should ease, in time, as your coils fully adapt. But I won't lie to you, it may also be the first sign that full activation isn't as far off as either of us initially anticipated. Naruto's breath caught. You think it could activate soon? Like before the exam soon? I think, Aizen said slowly, that stress and danger have always been the most reliable catalysts for a Sharingan's first awakening, and given the trajectory you're currently on, heading toward an exam explicitly designed to place Genin under exactly that kind of pressure, I would not be at all surprised if your eye chooses that moment to fully assert itself, whether you are prepared for it or not. He fixed Naruto with a steady, serious look. Which is precisely why the coming weeks of training matter so much, Naruto. We do not have the luxury of a slow, gradual mastery here. You need at least a foundational understanding of what you're carrying before circumstance forces the issue for you. Naruto swallowed hard, the weight of the timeline settling over him with fresh urgency. Okay. So, where do we start? Aizen's mouth curved into something that was almost, despite the gravity of the moment, a genuine smile. We start, he said, with patience, and with breath, and with teaching that stubborn mind of yours to stop fighting against a gift it does not yet understand. He rose slowly from his chair, gesturing for Naruto to follow him toward a small back room Naruto hadn't yet seen, dim, quiet, deliberately isolated. Tonight we begin properly. And Naruto, I must ask something of you, given what you've just told me about your sensei's suspicions. From this point forward, we train later, and more carefully than before. The stakes of discovery have just risen considerably, for both of us. Yeah, Naruto said quietly, thinking of Kakashi's sharp, watchful eye and the careful, deliberate way he noted the bandage beneath Naruto's hood. Yeah, I got that loud and clear today. The days that followed fell into a rhythm unlike anything Naruto had experienced before, a grueling, secretive double life split between two very different disciplines, two very different teachers, and two very different parts of himself that, as it turned out, did not particularly want to cooperate with each other. Mornings belonged to Jiraiya and the open training ground outside the village, sunlight and sweat and the slow, careful work of chakra thread control that was finally, gradually, beginning to click into place. Nights belonged to Aizen in the small, dim back room hidden in the empty Uchiha district, where Naruto sat cross-legged on a thin cushion for what felt like hours at a stretch, doing something that looked, from the outside, like absolutely nothing at all. This is stupid, Naruto said for probably the 5th time that week, rubbing at his bandaged eye in frustration. I'm just sitting here. How is sitting here supposed to teach me anything? Because the Sharingan, Aizen said, with the patience of a man who had clearly explained this concept to more than one frustrated student in his lifetime, is not a technique you learn the way you learn a jutsu, Naruto. It is a perceptual shift. A different way of processing the world entirely, and that shift cannot happen if your mind is a battlefield of impatience and noise every time you attempt to access it. He gestured toward the low cushion across from his own. Sit. Breathe. Let your thoughts settle, the way water settles once you stop disturbing it. We are not training your eye tonight. We are training the mind that will eventually have to control it. Naruto huffed but obeyed, settling back into position, closing his one working eye, the other still wrapped, still healing, still throbbing faintly whenever he pushed himself too hard, and forcing his breathing to slow the way Aizen had drilled into him night after night. It was, if he was being honest with himself, the hardest part of the entire process so far. Harder than the surgery. Harder than the fever. Sitting still had never been Naruto's strong suit, not in the academy, not on missions, not anywhere in his entire life, really, and the sheer effort of forcing his restless mind into something resembling stillness left him more exhausted, some nights, than an entire day of physical training with Jiraiya. But slowly, agonizingly slowly, something was beginning to shift. There, Aizen murmured, watching him carefully from across the small room. Do you feel that? The way the room seems to sharpen, just slightly, at the edges of your closed eye. Naruto almost lost the thread of concentration entirely in his surprise. Yeah, actually. How did you? Because I have watched hundreds of Uchiha children take their first steps toward this exact sensation, over the course of my life, Aizen said, something warm and almost nostalgic entering his voice. It is unmistakable, once you know what to look for. Hold on to that feeling. Do not chase it, do not grasp for more than it offers freely, simply notice it, and let it grow at its own pace. For the first time since the transplant, Naruto allowed himself something that felt, cautiously, like hope. Now I want to slow down here for a second, because I know a lot of you are eager to get to the flashy stuff, the actual teleporting, the actual Sharingan activation, and don't worry, we're getting there. But I think it's important to show the unglamorous grind underneath a power fantasy like this. Real growth doesn't happen in a single dramatic training montage. It happens in 100 small, boring, frustrating repetitions that eventually add up to something bigger. Anyway, let's fast forward a bit, because there's a breakthrough coming, and it's a big one. A week and a half into the parallel training, Jiraiya finally decided Naruto's chakra thread control had reached a point worth testing against something more concrete than a stationary practice post. Alright, Jiraiya said, tossing Naruto one of the specially marked kunai, not his father's originals, which remained carefully preserved back at the archive, but close replicas Jiraiya had crafted himself, etched with a simplified version of the marking seal for training purposes. Time to see if all that patience actually sticks under a little pressure. Mark the post. Naruto caught the kunai, turned, and hurled it toward the wooden post at the edge of the clearing with practiced ease. His aim, at least, had never been the problem. The blade sank into the wood with a solid thunk, the seal along its handle flickering faintly to life. Good. Now, without moving from where you're standing, I want you to feel for that seal. Not look at it, feel it. Chakra recognizes chakra, even at a distance, if you know how to reach for it properly. Naruto closed his eyes, reaching out the way Jiraiya had taught him, searching for that faint, familiar thread of his own chakra now anchored to the post 10 feet away. It took him a moment, longer than he would have liked, but eventually he found it, a small, steady pulse at the very edge of his awareness, like a lantern glimpsed through fog. Got it, he said. I can feel it. Good. Now, and I want you to really focus here, because this next part is where it gets tricky. I want you to picture yourself standing exactly where that seal is. Not wishing you were there, not imagining what it would look like. Knowing, with absolute certainty, that in the next instant you will be. Naruto frowned, concentrating hard, picturing the post, the seal, the exact patch of dirt directly in front of it. Nothing happened. He opened his eyes, deflating slightly. Nothing happened. Didn't expect it to, not on the first real attempt, Jiraiya said unbothered. This is the hardest conceptual leap of the entire technique, kid, and I'd honestly be a little worried if you nailed it on try one. The marking and the retrieval are two entirely separate skills, and stitching them together into a single instantaneous action is what actually separates the Flying Thunder Raijin from every other space-time technique out there. Your father failed this exact drill probably 30, 40 times before it finally clicked for him. Great, Naruto muttered. So how many times did it take? Jiraiya's mouth quirked. 41, if my memory serves. Made him insufferably smug about it once he finally got it, too. So don't feel bad if this takes you a while. You come by the stubbornness honestly, but so does the eventual payoff. Naruto huffed out a short laugh despite his frustration, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. Okay. 41 tries. I can beat that. That's the spirit. Now do it again. They worked through the drill for the better part of 2 hours, Naruto's attempts growing incrementally closer with each repetition. A flicker of displacement here. A brief, disorienting lurch there, though nothing that actually succeeded in moving him even an inch from where he stood. By the time the sun had climbed high overhead and sweat had soaked clean through his shirt, Naruto was breathing hard, chakra reserves noticeably strained, and increasingly, uncomfortably aware of a familiar dull throb building behind his bandaged eye. You alright? Jiraiya asked, catching the way Naruto pressed a hand briefly to the side of his face. You've been favoring that eye a lot today. It's fine, Naruto said quickly. Too quickly, judging by the way Jiraiya's gaze sharpened slightly. Just still healing up from banging it on that tree stump. Still gets a little sore sometimes. Jiraiya studied him a beat longer, something thoughtful and faintly skeptical passing behind his expression, before letting it go with a small shrug. All right. Just don't push yourself past what your body can handle. We've got time before the exams, not a ton of it, but enough that you don't need to run yourself into the ground trying to force a technique this advanced overnight. If only you knew how little time I actually have, Naruto thought, guilt twisting uncomfortably in his gut at yet another half-truth stacked on top of all the others he'd been telling everyone around him these past weeks. He was getting disturbingly good at lying to the people who cared about him. He wasn't sure that was something to be proud of. Yeah, this double life is getting harder and harder to maintain, and honestly, that's exactly the kind of tension I wanted to build into this arc. Naruto's not just fighting to master 2 S-rank techniques under a brutal timeline. He's fighting to keep the people who care about him at arm's length while he does it, and that's going to cost him eventually. But hey, let's get to the good part, because tonight's session with Aizen is about to change everything. That evening, Naruto arrived at the hidden house more exhausted than he'd been in days, his chakra reserves still not fully recovered from the morning's drills, the dull throb behind his bandaged eye having settled into something closer to a persistent, grinding ache. Aizen took one look at him, and frowned. You have been pushing yourself too hard. I'm fine, Naruto said for what felt like the 100th time that week, though even he could hear how threadbare the claim had worn by now. You are not fine, and I would ask you to stop insisting otherwise, at least with me, Aizen said, not unkindly, gesturing for him to sit. I understand the urgency you feel, Naruto, truly I do, but there is a meaningful difference between disciplined effort and reckless self-destruction, and you are dangerously close to crossing from one into the other. Your body has undergone a significant trauma in recent weeks. It requires rest as much as it requires training, or you risk undoing the very progress you are so desperate to accelerate. Naruto sighed, some of the fight draining out of him as he settled onto the cushion across from the old man. I don't have a lot of time, Aizen. The exams are coming up fast, and I still can't even get the teleportation thing to actually work, and my eye still doesn't do anything except throb and make me see weird shapes when I close it, and breathe, Aizen said firmly, cutting through the rising tide of frustration with quiet, practiced authority. You are allowing fear to drive you, rather than purpose. That is precisely the state of mind that produces mistakes, in both the techniques you are attempting to learn. He paused, studying Naruto's exhausted, frustrated expression with something that looked almost like sympathy. Tell me, when you attempt the marking retrieval with your teacher, what do you picture, in the moment just before you attempt to move? Naruto frowned, thinking back over the dozens of failed attempts from that morning. I don't know. The post, I guess. Where I want to end up. And do you see it? Truly see it. The precise angle of the wood grain, the exact distance and trajectory required, the subtle shift in air pressure between where you stand and where you intend to arrive. Or do you simply hold a vague, approximate impression of the location in your mind and hope your chakra fills in the details? Naruto opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, actually considering the question for the first time. The second one, I guess, he admitted slowly. I don't think I've ever pictured it that clearly. I've just been trying to feel where the chakra is and will myself there. Something sparked behind Aizen's dark eyes, the particular light of a teacher watching a student stumble unknowingly toward exactly the insight he'd been waiting for. And there, he said quietly, is precisely where your father's genius and my clan's gift were always meant to intersect. Naruto blinked. What do you mean? The flying thunder Raijin, as your father originally conceived it, relies on a chakra marker to establish a fixed point of displacement, reliable, but limited to locations you have physically touched and marked in advance, Aizen explained, leaning forward slightly, old excitement threading through his careful, measured voice. A brilliant technique in its own right, but bound by a significant constraint. You can only ever travel to where you have already been, or where a marker has already been placed. Your father's ambition, the collaboration he proposed to me, all those years ago, was to transcend that limitation entirely, to use the Sharingan's unparalleled perceptual clarity not merely to track a marked point, but to perceive an unmarked point, or a moving target, with such absolute precision that the chakra marking and the displacement itself could occur in the same fluid instant, guided by sight rather than memory alone. Naruto's breath caught. You're saying, I could mark somewhere I'm looking at, right now, without ever having touched it before? In theory, given sufficient mastery of both disciplines, Yes. Aizen's dark eyes gleamed with old, long-buried ambition finally finding purchase again after years of dormancy. The Sharingan does not merely see faster than the ordinary eye, Naruto. In its fuller expression, it perceives the underlying structure of movement itself, trajectory, chakra flow, the subtle physical tells that precede an action before it fully manifests. Paired correctly with your father's marking formula, such perception could theoretically allow you to place a chakra marker on a target through sight alone, react to movement in real time rather than relying on pre-established points, and displace yourself with a precision no ordinary application of either technique could achieve independently. He paused, something solemn entering his voice beneath the excitement. This was the dream your father and I shared, all those years ago, before circumstance stole the chance to see it through. It is, I believe, precisely the reason he began exploring my clan's gifts in the first place, not merely as an academic curiosity, but because he understood, even then, the staggering potential such a fusion represented. Naruto sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the sheer scope of what Aizen was describing slowly sinking in. That's insane. That's actually insane. Nobody's ever done that before, right? Combined them like that? No one that I am aware of, Aizen confirmed quietly. Which is precisely why, if we succeed, Naruto, what you will carry will not simply be an inheritance of two separate bloodline gifts. It will be something genuinely new. A technique your father dreamed of, brought to life by hands he never got the chance to guide directly. His weathered face softened, old grief and fresh hope intertwining in his expression. I would be lying if I told you the road ahead is anything less than extraordinarily difficult. What we are attempting here has no precedent, no established curriculum, nothing beyond scattered notes, and old theory to guide us. But I believe, and I do not offer this belief lightly, that you are capable of walking that road, if you are willing to put in the work it demands. Naruto felt something settle in his chest, not the frantic, anxious urgency he'd been operating under for days now, but something steadier, something that felt, for the first time since the transplant, genuinely like purpose rather than desperation. Okay, he said quietly. Then let's figure out how to actually do it. Where do we start? Aizen's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile. We start, he said, with your eye. Because before you can ever hope to mark a target through sight alone, you must first learn to properly see. And that, Naruto Uzumaki, begins tonight. Okay, I know a lot of you are waiting for the actual Sharingan activation, and trust me, we're building right up to it. But I wanted to take a second here to really sell you on why this fusion matters so much. Because honestly, once you understand what Naruto's father and Aizen were actually trying to build here, the whole premise of this series gets so much bigger than cool ninja gets two powers. This is a technique that's never existed before. Let's keep going, because things are about to escalate fast. Aizen guided him through a series of focused visualization exercises that night. Nothing flashy, nothing that would have looked impressive to an outside observer, but exercises that demanded a level of mental discipline Naruto had never before been asked to summon. Staring at a single lit candle across the room and attempting to hold every flicker of its flame in perfect, unbroken focus. Tracing the precise path of a falling leaf, released from Aizen's weathered hand, attempting to predict its trajectory before it ever touched the ground. It was frustrating, tedious work, and more than once Naruto found his concentration slipping, his mind wandering back toward the looming deadline of the exams, toward Kakashi's suspicious, watchful eye, toward the ache still radiating from behind his bandaged socket. And then, on his 11th attempt at tracking the falling leaf, something shifted. The world seemed to slow, not literally, he understood distantly, but the way his mind processed it slowed, sharpened. Every individual flutter of the leaf's descent suddenly rendered in impossible, granular clarity. He could see the precise angle of each gentle rotation, the faint shimmer of displaced air trailing in its wake. Details his ordinary vision had never once registered in 12 years of watching things fall. Beneath the bandage, his transplanted eye burned, not the familiar dull throb of healing tissue, but something sharper, hotter, a sensation like the eye itself was waking up for the very first time. Aizen, he gasped, hand flying up toward the bandage on pure reflex. Something's happening. Do not touch it, Aizen said sharply, though his voice carried more excitement than alarm. Let it happen, Naruto. Do not fight it, and do not force it further than it wishes to go on its own. Simply observe. The burning intensified for one long, terrifying moment, and then, gradually, began to ease, fading back into the familiar, dull ache Naruto had grown accustomed to over the past weeks, though something beneath the bandage felt subtly, permanently different now. Charged somehow. Awake, in a way it hadn't been just moments before. What happened? Naruto asked, breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing through him. Aizen was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression of profound, almost reverent satisfaction. What happened, he said slowly, is that your Sharingan has just taken its first true step toward awakening. Not fully, not yet, but the foundation has been laid, tonight, weeks ahead of what I honestly believed possible. He rose from his cushion, crossing to Naruto's side, careful hands beginning to gently unwind the edge of the bandage. I believe it is time we finally saw what lies beneath these wrappings properly. Are you ready? Naruto's heart hammered against his ribs, a wild mixture of terror and anticipation surging through him in equal measure. Yeah, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I'm ready. The bandage fell away. And for one long, suspended moment, as Naruto slowly, carefully opened an eye he had not used in weeks, the small dim room seemed to hold its breath along with him. Every shadow, every flickering candle flame, every fine grain of the wooden floorboards beneath him suddenly rendered in a depth and clarity his ordinary vision had never once achieved. Somewhere at the very edge of his vision, reflected faintly in the dark surface of a nearby water basin, Naruto caught his first glimpse of something new staring back at him, a single, unmistakable comma-shaped mark, blooming crimson against a background that had, for 12 years of his life, always simply been blue. The days that followed the first Tomo's appearance passed in a strange, electric blur, a mixture of exhilaration and mounting exhaustion that left Naruto feeling, more often than not, like he was being stretched thin across two entirely separate lives that refused to leave him any room to simply rest. By day, Jiraiya pushed him relentlessly through the marking retrieval drills, Naruto's chakra thread control sharpening with every repetition even as his actual attempts at displacement continued to fall short. Again and again, each failure chipping a little further at his patience. By night, Aizen guided him through increasingly demanding exercises meant to coax the newly awakened eye into fuller, more reliable function, tracking multiple moving objects at once, holding the strange, sharpened clarity of his vision steady even under mounting fatigue, learning to activate the eye deliberately rather than waiting for it to flare unbidden in moments of stress. You look like you haven't slept in a week, Sakura observed one morning at Training Ground 7, squinting at him with open concern as he stifled a jaw-cracking yawn for the third time in as many minutes. Seriously, Naruto, are you feeling okay? You've been weird lately. I'm great, Sakura-chan, Naruto said, forcing more energy into his voice than he currently possessed. Just been staying up late. Working on some stuff. What kind of stuff? Just stuff. Training stuff. He winced internally at how unconvincing that sounded even to his own ears, and was relieved when Sasuke's arrival a moment later drew Sakura's attention elsewhere, sparing him from having to elaborate further on a lie that was getting thinner by the day. Kakashi, predictably, was harder to slip past. You're distracted, their sensei observed partway through a sparring drill, watching Naruto stumble through a combination he'd executed cleanly a dozen times before. More distracted than usual, and that's saying something. Just tired, Naruto muttered, righting himself and resetting his stance. Kakashi's visible eye lingered on him a beat too long, the same careful, assessing look he'd worn in the market street weeks ago, the look of a man quietly cataloging inconsistencies he had every intention of eventually piecing together. You know, for someone who claims to just be tired, you've been remarkably good at avoiding direct eye contact with me lately. Naruto's stomach dropped, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. Didn't realize I was doing that. Kakashi said again, and let the matter drop, for now, though the weight of his suspicion lingered in the air between them for the rest of the session. A slow-burning fuse Naruto knew, with growing dread, was only a matter of time before it reached its end. Yeah, Kakashi's not letting this go, and honestly, I love that for the story, because it raises the stakes so much more than if Naruto's secret just sailed through undetected. Anyway, let's get to the part you're all here for, because tonight's training session with Aizen is about to produce the breakthrough this entire arc has been building toward. Focus, Aizen said quietly, watching Naruto from across the small training room, a single lit candle standing between them on the wooden floor, its flame flickering gently in the still night air, not on the flame itself, on the space around it. The Sharingan's gift is not merely sharper sight, it is the ability to perceive the field in which movement occurs, rather than fixating on a single point within it. Naruto exhaled slowly, letting his transplanted eye, no longer bandaged now, the crimson iris and single tomo fully visible whenever he chose to activate it, a low, familiar burn accompanying the shift each time, settle into that particular, sharpened focus Aizen had spent the past several nights carefully teaching him to summon and hold. The room around him seemed to slow, the way it always did once the Sharingan fully engaged, every subtle current of displaced air around the candle flame suddenly visible, every microscopic flicker and shift rendered in impossible clarity. Good, Aizen murmured. Now, without looking away from that broader field of perception, throw the marked kunai toward the far wall. Naruto's hand moved on reflex, the three-pronged kunai leaving his fingers in a smooth, practiced arc, sinking into the wooden wall with a solid thunk, its seal flickering to life exactly as it had 100 times before during his morning sessions with Jiraiya. Now, Aizen said, voice low and steady, do not simply feel for the marker, the way your other teacher has taught you. See it. Let your eye trace the exact line between where you stand and where that seal now rests. Do not calculate the distance. Perceive it, whole and complete, the way you perceived the candle flames every flicker a moment ago. Naruto's breath caught as something shifted in his awareness. The seal on the far wall suddenly not merely a distant, faint pulse at the edge of his senses, the way it had always registered under Jiraiya's instruction, but something rendered in full, vivid clarity, a precise, unbroken line connecting his current position to the exact point where the kunai now rested, as though his transplanted eye had drawn the path itself directly onto his vision. I can see it, he breathed. I can actually see the whole path. Not just feel where it is. It's like a straight line, right there. Then take it, Aizen said quietly. Not with hesitation. Not with doubt. Commit fully, the way you have practiced with your teacher every morning this past week. But let your eye guide the certainty this time, rather than memory alone. Naruto closed what remained of the distance between concept and instinct, gathering the careful thread of chakra Jiraiya had spent weeks teaching him to summon, letting it flow not toward a vague, half-remembered impression of the target, but toward the vivid, unbroken line his Sharingan now traced with perfect clarity between himself and the marked kunai across the room. The world lurched. There was no other way to describe it, a violent, disorienting wrench of sensation, as though the space between 2 points had simply folded in on itself and deposited him bodily on the other side of the fold. One instant Naruto stood 10 feet from the far wall. The next, he was there, kunai handle pressed against his palm, the wooden wall inches from his face, his own footprints still visible on the floor exactly where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. For a long, stunned moment, either of them said anything at all. Did I? Naruto managed finally, staring down at his own hand wrapped around the kunai handle, at the distance he just closed in less time than it took to blink. Did that actually just happen? Did I actually just? You did, Aizen said, and there was something in his weathered voice, awe, and grief, and pride all tangled together, that made Naruto's chest ache with an emotion he didn't have a name for. You did it, Naruto. On your first genuine attempt, guided fully by sight rather than memory alone. The old man crossed the room slowly, hand trembling faintly as he reached out to rest it against Naruto's shoulder. Your father spent years chasing this exact result, and never once achieved it in his lifetime. Do you understand what you've just accomplished? Naruto's throat had gone tight, the enormity of the moment settling over him in a wave he wasn't fully prepared for. I finished it, he said quietly. The thing he was working on. I actually finished it. You have taken the first true step toward finishing it, Aizen corrected gently, though the warmth in his voice undercut any real severity to the correction. One successful displacement, across a mere 10 feet of open space, guided by sight rather than a pre-established marker alone. There is still an enormous amount of refinement ahead of you before this technique reaches anything close to what your father envisioned. But Naruto, his grip on Naruto's shoulder tightened, just slightly. What you accomplished tonight is not nothing. It is, in fact, extraordinary. I want you to sit with that, even as we continue the work ahead. Okay, I have to be honest, I got a little emotional writing that scene, not gonna lie. There's something about a kid finishing his dead father's work without ever having known him that just hits different. Anyway, you know what's coming next, right? Naruto's not going to be satisfied with 10 feet. Let's see how far he pushes this. Over the following week, the breakthrough compounded on itself with startling speed. What had taken agonizing, frustrated weeks to achieve even partially now accelerated at a pace that left both Jiraiya and Aizen, separately, each unaware of quite how far the other's instruction had carried Naruto's progress, increasingly astonished. Alright, that's genuinely unsettling, Jiraiya admitted one morning, watching Naruto complete a clean, precise displacement across the training ground for the 4th time in a row, each attempt tighter and more controlled than the last. Kid, 3 weeks ago you couldn't hold a chakra thread steady for longer than 10 seconds. Now you're chaining displacements together like you've been doing this your whole life. What in the world's gotten into you? Naruto, breathing hard but grinning despite the exhaustion, deflected as smoothly as he could manage. Guess I'm just a natural. Runs in the family, right? Jiraiya's eyes narrowed slightly, something thoughtful passing behind them. Not quite suspicion, not yet, but the particular attentiveness of a shrewd, experienced shinobi noticing a pattern that didn't fully add up. Yeah, he said slowly. Guess it does. He didn't push further, but Naruto caught the lingering, considering look Jiraiya gave him before turning back toward the next drill, and made a private, uneasy note to be more careful about how visibly his progress was accelerating during their sessions together. He was quickly learning, an exhausting balancing act, advancing quickly enough to be ready for whatever the exams demanded, while advancing slowly enough, visibly, that neither of his teachers pieced together the full truth of what the other was contributing. Yeah, this double training thing is getting harder to juggle by the day, and honestly, I don't think it's sustainable much longer, which, don't worry, is very much intentional on my part as the person writing this story. But let's get to the real meat of this chapter, because there's a scene coming up that I think is going to change the entire tone of this arc. It happened on a warm evening exactly 1 week before the Chūnin Exams were set to begin, during what should have been an entirely unremarkable night of training with Aizen. They'd been working, as they had most nights that week, on extending the range and precision of Naruto's displacement technique, pushing from 10 feet to 20, then to the full length of the small training room and beyond, out into the modest overgrown courtyard behind the hidden house where Aizen had, over the years, quietly maintained a private space shielded from outside observation. Further this time, Aizen instructed, watching from the courtyard's edge as Naruto planted a marked kunai at the far boundary of the walled space, a distance of nearly 40 feet, the furthest attempt yet. And Naruto, I want you to try something slightly different tonight. Rather than tracing the full line from where you stand to where the marker rests, I want you to attempt tracking a point of movement instead. A target that is not stationary. Naruto frowned, wiping sweat from his brow. You mean like, actually moving? While I'm trying to mark it? Precisely. This is, ultimately, the true purpose behind combining these two disciplines, not simply a faster, more versatile way of reaching a fixed point, but the ability to react to a target in motion, tracking and marking it in real time, closing the distance before an opponent even fully registers you've moved. Aizen gestured toward a scattering of loose, fist-sized stones near the courtyard wall. I am going to throw these, one after another, in varying directions. I want you to attempt marking one mid-flight, and displacing to intercept it before it strikes the ground. Naruto swallowed hard, a fresh spike of nervous adrenaline cutting through his exhaustion. That's a lot harder than a wall. It is considerably harder, Aizen agreed. Which is precisely why we begin practicing it now, under safe and controlled conditions, rather than allowing your first attempt at tracking a moving target to occur during actual combat, where the margin for error will be considerably less forgiving. His dark eyes were steady, encouraging. You have made remarkable progress in a remarkably short span of time, Naruto. I do not say this lightly. But do not mistake speed of progress for mastery. Approach this next step with the same patience that has carried you this far. Naruto nodded, activating his Sharingan with the low, familiar burn that no longer startled him the way it had weeks ago, settling into the wide, sharpened field of perception Aizen had spent so many nights teaching him to summon and hold. Ready, he said. Aizen hurled the first stone in a smooth, easy arc across the courtyard. Naruto's eye tracked it instantly, the stone's full trajectory rendered in vivid, unbroken clarity, every subtle variation in its spin and speed suddenly obvious in a way his ordinary vision had never once achieved. He reached for it with a thread of chakra, marking it mid-flight the way Aizen had described, and felt the familiar, violent lurch of displacement pull him forward. He materialized directly in the stone's path, close enough that it clipped his shoulder rather than sailing past entirely, sending a jolt of surprised pain through his arm and knocking him off balance enough that he stumbled hard into the courtyard dirt. Ow, okay, that hurt way more than I expected. But you intercepted it, Aizen said, something like genuine astonishment coloring his voice as he crossed the courtyard to check on him. On your very first attempt, Naruto. Are you injured? Just my pride, mostly. Naruto pushed himself back up, rubbing at his throbbing shoulder, a fierce, disbelieving grin spreading across his face despite the pain. I actually did it. I actually caught a moving target. You did, Aizen confirmed, and for the first time since Naruto had known him, the old man's careful, measured composure cracked entirely into something raw and unguarded, a wide, genuine smile, edges wet with unshed tears, the expression of a man watching a dream he'd long since buried finally, impossibly, coming true. Naruto, do you understand what this means? What we have just proven is possible tonight. Naruto shook his head slowly, still catching his breath. It means, Aizen said, voice thick with emotion, that your father's vision was not merely theoretical. It was not an old man's grief-stricken fantasy, clung to for over a decade with no real hope of ever seeing it realized. It is real, Naruto. You have made it real, in less than 2 months, at an age far younger than either your father or I ever dared imagine such mastery could be achieved. He pressed a trembling hand briefly against Naruto's shoulder, careful of the fresh bruise forming there. I have waited 12 years to see this. I confess I had largely given up hope of ever seeing it at all. Naruto felt something hot and overwhelming rise in his own chest, matching the old man's emotion in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. We did it together, he said quietly. You and my dad both. I just finished what you guys started. No, Aizen said, shaking his head slowly, dark eyes bright and fierce. You did far more than finish it, Naruto Uzumaki. You have made something new, something neither your father nor I, even working together, ever fully achieved in our own time. This technique belongs to you now. Whatever name history eventually gives it, I have no doubt it will carry your legacy forward, not merely ours. Man, okay, I know I keep saying I got emotional writing these scenes, but I really did with that one. There's something about an old man finally getting to see a dead friend's dream come true through his son that just wrecks me a little. Anyway, I promise this chapter's not going to end on an entirely happy note, because we've still got some tension left to address. Let's check back in with Kakashi, because he's not done being suspicious. The following morning, Naruto arrived at Training Ground 7 still faintly buzzing with the exhilaration of the previous night's breakthrough, a mistake, he would quickly realize, given how poorly he managed to mask his elevated mood despite his exhaustion. You're in a good mood, Sakura observed, eyeing him with open suspicion as he offered an uncharacteristically bright greeting despite his obvious fatigue. What happened? Did Irika-sensei finally agree to treat you to ramen again or something? Something like that, Naruto said, deflecting with a grin that felt, for once, entirely genuine rather than forced. Kakashi, arriving late as always with that same unhurried, orange book reading saunter, took one look at Naruto's expression and something in his posture went subtly, carefully alert. You're practically glowing, their sensei observed, tucking his book away with deliberate slowness, his single visible eye studying Naruto with an intensity that made the good mood curdle rapidly into fresh anxiety. That's new. Care to share what's got you so pleased with yourself this morning? Just, good training session yesterday, Naruto said, forcing the enthusiasm out of his voice as best he could. Made some progress on stuff I've been working on. What stuff? Just, personal training stuff. Kakashi's gaze held on him a beat too long, something calculating passing behind that single dark eye. You've been saying that a lot lately, he said mildly. Personal training stuff. Very specific, very vague, all at the same time. He tilted his head slightly, and Naruto had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of watching several separate pieces of a puzzle click quietly into place behind their sensei's carefully neutral expression. You know, Naruto, I've been doing this job a long time. I know what a genin looks like when he's genuinely improving through hard, honest training. I also know what one looks like when he's hiding something considerably bigger than a stomach bug and a bruised head. He let the silence stretch, deliberate and pointed. I'm not going to push you today, but I want you to understand something clearly. Whatever you're carrying, whatever secret's got you disappearing for days and flinching every time someone gets a good look at your face, it's going to come out eventually. Secrets like that always do, especially under the kind of pressure the exams are about to put all three of you under. I'd rather you tell me on your own terms, before that happens, than have me find out some other way. Naruto's mouth had gone dry, his earlier exhilaration collapsing into cold, familiar dread. There's nothing to tell, sensei. Really. Kakashi studied him a moment longer, something almost sad flickering behind his careful, guarded expression, the look of a man who cared deeply about the genin in front of him and hated, genuinely hated, watching that genin lie to his face. All right, he said finally, voice quiet. Have it your way for now. Let's get to training. But as the session wore on, Naruto couldn't shake the cold, creeping certainty settling into his gut, that whatever careful balance he'd been maintaining these past weeks, whatever fragile secrecy Aizen and Hiruzen had worked so hard to preserve, was rapidly running out of road. The exams were 1 week away. His technique, however extraordinary, was still raw, unrefined, barely tested outside the safety of a walled courtyard. And somewhere out there, watching and waiting with a patience Naruto couldn't begin to fully appreciate the danger of, were forces far more dangerous than a suspicious sensei. Forces that, if Aizen's warnings were to be believed, were already beginning to take quiet, careful notice of a genin whose chakra no longer quite matched the boy they thought they knew.